Hello, and this is going to be a little bit of a discussion on physiognomy. Um, it's just going to be some of the concepts and things that I find interesting about it that I wanted to share. My friend actually kind of asked me to go on a little bit of a ramble video about it, and I've talked about it before to him, so thanks, John. I'll just put your name out there since he's always shares my stuff, which is awesome. I really appreciate it. Uh, but yeah, I think if we were going to start this discussion, uh, Schopenhauer's thoughts on physiognomy is obviously pretty interesting and something to kind of build a grounding for what I want to do in this video. And he talks about, facial expressions and the intellect and how this is a compliment on the brain more than the actual properties of the limb or something like that. The kind of if we were gonna like throw some examples and even maybe use him as one, he talks about the genius and he ages he ages in this kind of you don't see the process of it at first. It comes on much later, and I think that cynically would have to do with the strain on the forehead skin and the kind of Schopenhauer isn't exactly a white pill, if you will. And I think if you look at his photos in his old age, you can definitely see that. Hell, you can even see it on myself. I've been honest about the kind of anxiousness, youth upbringing that I've had. But I think I've brushed up on this before on the channel about cranium sizes and how there's a kind of almost sense of giantism with it and the strain that it's putting on women in birth, and how much technology is needed to even give birth now, simply because of the sheer size of our people now. And it's interesting to point out when Schopenhauer kind of looks at other species and the relationship of the brain to the spine, and how low intellect creatures they move so sluggishly and in a clumsy like way, whereas we're kind of more of that the beast of prey, if you will, in a Spangler sense. We have the kind of synthesis almost between the limbs and the brain. And I think if we're gonna talk about this in a sort of hyper modern sense, if you will, the brain and the intellect were this rational and science driven society, and yet our health continues to deteriorate from these sort of pleasures and really plagues of the mind, if you will. The aspect of our mental health and just the anxiousness of diagnosing, even in a sense of trying to pinpoint anything that could deviate from within this range of being normal, if you will. There's entire fields that have this whole depth of knowledge that goes on where people spend their whole lives looking into these kind of things, if you will, and it's ultimately like diagnosis deviating away from what is norm. And I think the kind of synthesis, if you will, that Schopenhauer was talking about in his time has altered in that way, where the brain's heavier now, and the limbs aren't necessarily complementing that in that sense. Sure, they're larger in size, but the actual quality, if you will, the quality judgment is in poor deterioration. We're an extremely obese nation, despite understanding these kind of formulaic expressions of carb counting and this kind of understanding and intellect behind what we're putting inside of our bodies, these kind of vitamins and supplements and all these things that could be used to in a way undermine physiognomy, which is a kind of a point that Schopenhauer makes with the importance of being able to read it, is you can't curtail you can't curtail the face and the intellect. It's complementary in a way that you can only see that within it himself. You can't it's the objective view he's talking about, being totally away and kind of seen in this avatar, if you will, in a sense. And he kind of jokes, which is would be a joke any other time, but as I'm reading this, he goes over it's a wonder why people with their terrible characteristics would want to even be out in public and show their why don't they mask themselves. And it's kind of interesting, the trope and memes that you're kind of seeing, undertone of people who don't really have a lot to lose, if you will, wanting to keep the mask on. And in my own personal life, when I have to wear one at my job by their credence, when you kind of put the mask on, you not only lose any kind of aesthetic characteristics that you may think you have, or even that kind of expression of almost in that Schopenhauer sense of being able to kind of show an intentionality that the intellect might not be able to show just purely on its own in an abstract sense. But when you kind of absolve yourself of those characteristics, you not only are absorbing those kind of flaws, but you're also abolishing the aesthetic. There's kind of the joke on right-wing Twitter about these jaws being it should be a crime that I have to hide my jaws, things like that. This is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but there is that sort of, if we're not able to build this sort of judgment, then you can see why we have such a cynical, grifting outlook towards everything. Everything has this sort of conspiratorial explanation, if you will, and it's no wonder that so many people there's tons of people who have willingly admitted, like, I don't want to not wear my mask in public anymore. Like I'd prefer it, even like they genuinely do not want this sort of attitude and supposedly brief social kind of terms of service rule. They don't want it to go away anymore, and obviously hiding their flaws is ultimately their own problem, for one, and for two, this kind of goes into how I think one's own physiognomy is, like Schopenhauer says about most people don't even actually think. It's just the thoughts of other people. There's 25% of it, and even of that 25% of it, it's just what he thinks. And quite similar to that, the kind of physiognomy of our entire like society or greater culture, if most people want to hide it, then there isn't really much to gain from trying to find beauty if we're constantly seeking to undermine it, because if there's something, if something's beautiful, then you have to have something that contrasts. You can't everything just can't be, beautiful in that kind of sense. There has to be that contrast, and you're not going to find that kind of long-term harmony or growth, if you will, if we're all constantly trying to go about this egalitarian, as John wanted specifically to me to kind of target was, sort of the left wing, I would argue, attitude of fat acceptance, and this kind of identity around these unhealthy lifestyles. And, part of that, you could argue, if we want to kind of go down a sort of, my kind of Catholic upbringing, the Catholics were pretty woke about intellectualization, I think. And this is something that I've talked about on the channel because it's something it's kind of, from personal experiences that sort of, there's nothing, there's an old Jordan Peterson clip where that kind of stuck with me, where he has this joke about, there's, for a clinical psychologist in his field, like there's nothing worse than a client who's super intelligent, because it's really hard to actually like make some kind of rational argument to break them free from, kind of these suppositions that they've made that are ultimately delusions. And, it makes sense that we have all these kind of informations on carbs and our environment, and yet we know nothing about it, really, truly. There's almost kind of a gatekeeper's knowledge of being able to even figure out, some of the harmful things that are being put into our preservatives and stuff like that. Despite this so-called great, intelligent society that we have inherited, it just seems that the sort of decadence and even the weight of the cranium itself is actually undermining us and trying to form a synthesis of being more in that beast of prey mentality that kind of resonates with me from Spengler, and understanding of humanity and its exception, rather than this kind of egalitarian concepts that kind of undermined the actual responsibility that it takes to truly strive for a kind of aesthetic attitude of being this sort of greater node of your community. And I think when it comes to, the kind of bodybuilder Twitter sphere, the kind of baptism, if you will, that you see, there is the meme aspect to it, of course. And, I obviously follow these people myself on Twitter, and in some regards think highly of their content. But they're part of this is the kind of community building that they've done, where they're all trying to achieve this kind of aesthetic approach towards life, and trying to attain the kind of performance of the ideal that I talked about in my other video, maybe a month or so ago. And so yeah, this is kind of a little bit of a ramble about the kind of Schopenhauer intellect relationship with one's facial features, and I think the kind of the sort of lack of autonomy over the brain with mental illness, and the justifications of obesity and fat acceptance, even in these kind of rational notions of trying to justify it all. This amoral perspective that actually is kind of a critique that you could have of modern psychology and academia even. It's kind of interesting to look at it in that kind of perspective, and in regards to current public health and the kind of disregard of trying to have a relative like harmony or a synthesis with your health instead of trying to privilege one particular disease or incident over the greater context, if you will, or this kind of referral to not like a general outlook of like a disciplined life, if you will, but these kind of really hyper intellectualized groupings that maybe don't deserve the time of day that you would think, if we wanted to kind of look at it in an intellectual way rather than just such and such is corrupt attitude, if you will. And I guess another concept tying into my own kind of theories on this channel, the sort of the quantity of a life that we've all became fixated on, the utility and its utility, and its lack of perspective, really. It's just all in this kind of formulaic way of doing things instead of actually paying attention to the quality within those abstract systems. If you look at the physiognomy, if you will, and the limbs and slenderness of athletes, and compared even within those kind of exceptions, even you'll see these kind of different these differences even between their sizes and their weights, and this just kind of shows that you are the kind of making up of this own individual node for sure, but it's ultimately the greater sense of aesthetic that this greater want of being of having quality rather than just a sort of abstract systematic idea of, or a numerics kind of way of achieving towards our not just political aspirations even, but just life in general. And I think this kind of goes into as well why when I was extremely socially anxious and even had like panic disorder issues, one of the advices they have, other than obviously drugs, is exercise. And I think kind of to tie it all back into sort of the brain and the intellect is the brain gets exhausted from motion, from a conscious effort, from conscious will, to be in a kind of Schopenhauer way. You don't get tired because your heart is beating or your lungs are functioning. It's the kind of confrontation against this world around you, even, and to strive past that and to try to create motion and force is, part of actually living a healthy life, whether it's the stimulation of it on the limbs or just the motion intellectually, even in a kind of openness to thinkers and ideas and stuff like that. There's I've always kind of envisioned this almost motion to it of like riding through with these ideas that I think obviously is deeply encrusted within the West in particular. Gravity and forces and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting to consider that exercise and weightlifting for young men really do help settle the anxious, because I think it's part of that kind of that motion and that need for actual exhaustion and destruction of kind of these limb fibers to kind of create, most of the time, especially in America, when I've had people come to me for advice about working on their bodies. most of the time it's simply about, creating their motion enough to shed this excess weight that they've obtained. It's not even so much about actually building their limbs up. It's about creating the slenderness that Schopenhauer kind of discusses here within those fibers. And so, yeah, this was just kind of a little bit of a discussion in a kind of hyper modern sense of modern physiognomy, because I think it kind of goes hand in hand with the kind of grifting culture, this masked culture, willingness to cover up your flaws, and the kind of fat acceptance culture that John was talking about to me as well, is kind of a masking, if you will, of lack of motion, and that could obviously turn into a bad intellectual emotion, would be to summarize. But yeah, thanks for watching. This is just a little ramble video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you for the next one.